Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Radeon video we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, is popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with AMD and the Radeon leadership, specifically Raja Koduri. Then we're going to move over to Nvidia and the GTX 1070 Ti/Ti, specifically on rumours of announcements and some other cards that have appeared in the lineup and some other bits and pieces. And finally, the main crux of this video is going to be on the Xbox One division, because ahead of the Xbox One X's launch, Microsoft have seen to unveil the story of backwards compatibility with Xbox 360 games. It's actually pretty interesting, along with how Xbox original games are going to look either on the original Xbox One or the Xbox One X. Can we please just call that Scorpio? It sounds so much nicer. But a very small note before we start all of that, there are new drivers for both Crimson Relive, in other words AMD, and also GeForce graphics cards, and they're very important because they improve the performance of games such as Wolfenstein and Destiny. But a quick note on the Crimson Relive stuff: there is a GPU workload toggle, which is basically for certain 500, 400, 300, and even 200 graphics cards, which allows you to optimize between graphics or compute workloads. And secondly, there's also a compute support for 400, 500, and finally Vega graphics cards, for 12 of them running simultaneously in a Windows 10 system. The reason that's very important is because if you are, let's say, doing 3D rendering work, for sake of argument, this is very impressive, and in theory you could build a pretty monstrous system with some used or even new RX 500 based graphics cards or 400 based graphics cards, or even, you know, imagine the performance of like 12 Vega 56s, just for sake of argument. Anyway, talking of AMD and Radeon, there is an article which has popped up on fudzilla. And as usual, take the stuff with a pinch of salt until something is official. But according to the website fudzilla, they have said that there is going to possibly be a big shake-up at Radeon Technologies Group. Now don't forget, essentially the management for RTG, Radeon Technologies Group, has been handed over to Raja Koduri. Now, a couple of notes before we start on the whole tenure of Raja. First of all, Vega, whether you think it's the best graphics card since sliced bread, whether you think it was okay but perhaps just a bit overhyped, or whether you feel it's a major disappointment, although Raja could have done some stuff to improve the Vega direction, if you will, it ultimately wasn't his pet project. In other words, he had no say in the beginnings of the project, and by the time he took over and his position, it was already way too far in development for him to really change it completely, unless he wanted to scrap the project. Therefore, most of the IT industry would agree that Raja is going to be better judged. In other words, his leadership is going to be much better judged when it comes to Navi. So currently, Raja is taking a sabbatical, and Lisa Su, who is the CEO of AMD, is basically taking over his responsibilities. So all of the key elements of Radeon, and the GPU group are now reporting to Lisa Su directly. But it does look like, from the signals that people are hearing, RTG is going to be getting Raja back at the helm. Another small difference is that the RTG marketing team are now reporting directly to John Taylor, who is now the company's chief marketing officer. Now, he was responsible directly for helping make Ryzen and Epic rather successful. So what does all of this mean? Well, it's still early to judge. According to fudzilla, once again, I'm not saying they're correct, but according to them and their sources, it appears that RTG will probably lose some of its autonomy in the long run. In other words, it will probably be more being towed by the AMD ship, but it will still retain most of its credibility, most of its autonomy, and it looks like Raja is going to be coming back. And I'm actually okay with that. I think there are some weaknesses with Raja, primarily not actually on the technical side. I feel that his stage presence is just not quite up there. And I said this before as well with Lisa Su. one thing I will give Nvidia full credit with is when you see Jensen Huang talking on stage, he could be selling you a book of matches that has an additional match, and he will make it sound like a revolution. I wouldn't say he's quite on Steve Jobs level, but he has a level of articulation of passion. And I'm not saying that Raja is bad, I just don't think he has quite the hype to him. And that's something he can work on, perhaps if he was to take, a few classes on that. And I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. I really like Raja. I think he's an honest guy. I think he's a very intelligent guy. But I just think perhaps on his stage presence he could just work on that a bit. And to be honest with you, it's something you're going to have to learn. By which I mean that this is something you have to practice. And sometimes you do get lessons for it. But that's probably the main gripe I have with Raja. Next up, some GTX 1070 Ti/Ti. We have some new models of both Zotac and also PNY. This is thanks to videocards.com. Apparently the announcement for these cards is still going to be the 26th of October, so we've only got a few more days to go. Now, as a quick reminder, we have 19 out of 20 SM units enabled, so 2,432 CUDA cores total. The only slight caveat that's still up in the air, and I've said this before, but it's the memory bandwidth. Now, some people are reporting it's going to have 9 GBps memory, other people are reporting it's going to have 8, most people think it's going to have 8. The only reason I'm somewhat on the fence is that you do get even some models of the GTX 1060 which have 9 available. So whether this is going to be the case or not, we just don't quite know. And I do feel that the 1070 Ti in particular could certainly do with the additional memory bandwidth, because that would be rather tasty. But it does appear that we are still on schedule for the unboxing, specifications and that type of thing, in other words a paper launch, to be conducted about 2 days time, and the reviews / official sales are going to be in about 9 days time. Now finally, let's discuss the Xbox One / Xbox journey, shall we? I'd like to thank viewer Joe for actually sending me over this link. It's very interesting, and most of this information comes to us from an exclusive interview with IGN. So there is a lot of stuff on this interview, and honestly I don't want to read out their entire article verbatim, because some of this isn't really that technical, and some of it is more to do with the inner workings of Microsoft, so I'd highly suggest that you check that out. But we'll focus on the backwards compatibility stuff in terms of the technical aspect. So I'll link, as I said, their article in the video description, but focusing purely on the tech side of things, there are some very interesting things that we've learned. One of those was that the console's only online DRM changes, which were obviously removed towards the end of the system, before the system was launched, actually slowed down the emergence of the Xbox One backwards compatibility. Quote verbatim, the fan-first feature has evolved from an experiment conducted by 2 separate Microsoft research teams into a service plan for Xbox One's launch, complete with hardware hooks baked into Durango silicon. So basically the service was just scrapped, because obviously towards the end of the announcement it was growing increasingly obvious that gamers just weren't happy and were not going to accept this, and then before the system was available on store shelves they obviously scrapped it, which I guess actually sent the team somewhat scrambling. Now this might sound strange to you, but the emulation had not really just been something that Microsoft had started since the Xbox One had launched. In fact, as I mentioned, they've been planning this for some time. In fact, back in 2007, one of the teams was working on PowerPC CPU emulation, which was getting 32-bit code, which obviously the Xbox 360 was using, to run on a 64-bit architecture, which we found out, of course, the Xbox One was using. And there was another team, the separate team was in Beijing, and they were working on a virtual GPU emulator, which was based upon the Xbox 360's GPU. Now originally this started out with just software, but it just was too taxing on a CPU to be able to run. And apparently they had to bake some of the backwards compatibility support directly into the Xbox One silicon. because otherwise the XMA audio and texture formats were just too expensive to do on software, and it would take between 2 or even 3 of the Xbox One's CPU cores just to run it. The other option was very much like Sony did with the PS2 or PS3, when they had chips of the older generation systems being put in to basically run the older generation. For example, with the PS3, they had a chip in there so that it was a SoC, so that you could run PS2 games. However, Microsoft decided that this wasn't the route for them to go down. The reason behind that was twofold. One, it was going to increase the cost, and two, it would have meant that they would have just had parity. In other words, they wouldn't have been able to improve what was already there. It would just basically look similar. The next big issue they had was with this CPU's scheduler. This, of course, does exactly what you would expect it to, given the name. It essentially schedules workloads over the processor. So what happened was the Xbox 360 CPU and the Xbox One CPU both ran at different speeds when it came to the scheduler's specifications, and so they decided to change things, tweak things, and that allowed 104 games to be backwards compatible in the first year. So what about original Xbox games on the Xbox One? Well, that's where things get a bit weird. They did decide to try and emulate it via the Xbox 360's Vision emulator, but it failed. And there's a reason behind that. With the original Xbox, it manages memory in 4 kilobyte increments. Accordingly, the Xbox One does so with 64K. And when you combine the fact that the first Xbox used a 32-bit CPU, whereas One uses a 64-bit CPU, it basically just took them a huge engineering effort. And what did we get for all of their trouble? Well, it looks rather amazing. You have 13 original Xbox games which will work using backwards compatibility, and these aren't bad games by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I suspect prices of these games, the physical versions, because you will be able to buy them physically and digitally, is going to become pretty high. These games include Ninja Gaiden Black and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that if you decide to play a game on the Xbox One X, which was, as I said, the original Xbox, you're going to be able to see an increased pixel count by 16 times that of the original. Meanwhile, the original Xbox One, as well as the S, will turn it 4 times the number of pixels on screen, which is still bloody impressive. Finally, Xbox 360 games, which will be running on Xbox One X, will also look rather spiffy as well. We're going to see Fallout 3, Oblivion, Assassin's Creed, as well as Halo 3, all running with a much higher resolution, up to 9 times that of the original games. That's very damn impressive, in my opinion. And I have to say, it's a very impressive achievement for the Xbox One, and, well, just for Microsoft's programming skills in general. Very awesome. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.